should stop. Bonjour. But a Hungarian, you'll have to do it, László.
Jó estét.
There you go.
So we are online.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for the fine seminar. It is a pleasure, a true pleasure to have today with us László Garamszegi, and I will introduce him. I think I'd rather make a few announcements first so that if we have a few more people joining in a minute or two, they listen to the full introduction to László's. And I'll start with the things that will be repeated for sure. We're already working eagerly. We'll have another amazing fall 2021 fine seminar series. We are looking at, if it's not too early for you to mark your calendars, we're going to get started on September 7th and we'll go through December 14th. There will be 15 speakers. We're filling in the slots like crazy, so it's very motivating to see how much interest there is in joining us. Then I will say it again at the end, but it doesn't hurt to mention it before we get started. Next week, on May 4th, we're going to have Dustin Ravenstein from Columbia University in the USA. He's going to be presenting causes and consequences of sociality, spanning molecules to populations. So that's Dustin Rubenstein, if you want to again mark your calendars for what's coming up next week. In the chat, I see that Karsten has shared an announcement of a talk this coming Thursday that he considers may be of lots of interest to many of you. So, and I was hoping that there's one person that I suspect he must be busy attending to all the congratulations he's getting. So I'll hold on to that good news and surprise to see if he joins us. And I will proceed with introducing our speaker today. Our speaker today is László Garamszegi. László was in the Doñana field station in Spain up until 2 years ago, but now he's the director of the Institute of Ecology and Botany in the Center for Ecological Research in Hungary. So he's been able to go back to his roots, those were his words, and is now the director of that institute. He received his master's from Hungary, then got his PhD in France, validated it in Spain, which I suspect was a requisite to spend so many years working and doing research in Spain. And then he's also got some kind of PhD validation, I imagine, or honorary degree from Hungary more recently. I like we always do, it's fun to get to know a little bit more our speakers, and I spent some time browsing his CV and his website. What really struck me is that you look at the grants he's got, and in the last 4 years, he's got 4 different grants totaling about €1 million. But those 4 grants really span a range of topics, from developing computational tools for improving methods to doing comparative phylogenetic analysis of birds. And the most recent one, which I understand he got this year, is for doing a lot of citizen science in relationship to mosquitoes in Hungary. So that's a little bit of what he's been doing. When I will admit that I got to know about László not because of his work in comparative studies of birds, but I have become for some time now a fan of his publications in research methodology. And to those of you who are beginning to consider multimodal inference and information theory approaches, before jumping on the wagon and just going through the recipe, I strongly recommend that you read his paper, the 2011 article in Behavioral Ecology and Sociobiology. It's a must read if you're taking your first steps in applying information theory inference to your research. László brings to the use of these new analytical tools really a biological perspective to it. We're just discussing that. I mean, he's first and foremost, and I'm quoting what we're saying, we're talking about it, he said biologist first, but one that he's developed impressive skills in implementing adequate methodologies in the context of the biological questions he's exploring. And those questions today he'll be talking about the evolutionary ecology of dogs, phylogenetic comparative studies at the within species level. But like I said, if you browse his page, he's been interested in the evolution of brain size and neural capacity, host parasite interactions, the evolution of animal behavior, and the last one is acoustic communication and cultural evolution. So I'm sure we're up for a treat. And before I let László run away with it, I cannot take 30 seconds to give my most, I get chills when I say it, one of our colleagues and my dearest friend, Tony Di Fiore, who has been a regular attendee of the Science Seminar, has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences as of yesterday. And so to Tony, very congratulations. It's an honor to have you in the audience. And I know, better than most people, how much he's worked ever since we met as grad students back in Davis, 10 years ago only? So congratulations, Tony. And László, take it from here. I'll make you, no, Karsten, you have to make him a co-host.
I'm pretty sure I already did.
Okay.
Yes, did it?
Then László, you're ready to go? Not literally to go, more like, don't go, please. More like starting. There we go.
Is it okay now?
We do see, we have a presenter's view. So we're seeing your next slide. I don't know if you want to try that. Now you're ready.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much for these kind words. I was really impressed how much you know about me. It would be very difficult for me to give this summary about myself. So I really appreciate that you said these things. And I'm also very grateful for being here and for inviting me here. And actually, I consider this as a big challenge for me, because I consider that I didn't work on social evolution, but now it was a very good opportunity to look through my understanding on the system I work on and put this into this context. It was a really nice and stimulating experience. So hopefully I can fulfill the expectations and make a valuable contribution to this nice series of talks. So before I jump in the studies, I would like to mention my co-authors, my fellow co-workers who work in Sweden, Niklas Kolm and Hans Temrin, and also the other people who I work with in Hungary. This number of people also emphasizes the expertise, the different kind of expertise we are representing. And I think that if we want to say something new about dogs, we have to come up with a team like this and combine different kind of expertise. And this is I also liked in this in the course of these studies I'm going to present. So I think why we are here is that all of us are impressed by the tremendous amount of variation that we can observe in nature in terms of social organization. Different animals and also plants, they have different social life. They can differ in terms of general structure. They can differ in terms of relationships between individuals, the frequency in how they interact, and also the traits that are involved in the maintenance of these interactions. And from the evolutionary perspective, we are interested in the causes and consequences of this enormous amount of variation that we observe among species. We are trying to understand what are the main driver mechanisms that shape this interspecific variance. And one of the tools we are using to understand these how problems is the use of the comparative approach, because we have a considerable interspecific variation, and we want to know what are the selective forces that are behind this variation. So we need to discriminate between common ancestry and convergent evolution. I have taken a slide from my friend Peter Kappeler because I think this nicely summarizes the different approaches that we can use when we want to understand the causes and consequences of social structures and social behaviors. And what he also emphasized, that most people use the comparative approach because most of the fascinating variation can be observed at that level. Of course, this approach provided us with many studies that helped us to understand some evolutionary mechanisms behind this interspecific variance in social life. But of course, the approach has some limitations. Like other correlative approaches, we have to be careful with causality, so we cannot discriminate between causes and consequences. So we always have to be careful about making interpretations about the causal relationship between variables. The other constraints that was also emphasized by Peter is that we usually, in this context, we can usually focus on very crude measures like group size or mating system that describes the social structure in general. So we cannot estimate and work on fine mechanisms that shapes these structures. For example, we cannot investigate fine behaviors or interaction networks among individuals in this context, because we need a lot of data from different species. We need a lot of data that are obtained by using the same standards. So these data should be comparable as well. Of course, we have to understand when we do comparative approach among species variation, we are dealing with longer time scales. We are dealing with million years, and by that we are seeing the results that are coming from a long selection process, and that is observable at the level of the social structures. So my point is that this is something you can see on the top of the iceberg. You cannot really see defined evolutionary mechanisms that lead to these differences in social systems. You cannot see how individual behaviors may change during a shorter evolutionary timescale that can be observable, for example, at the within species level. So when you rely on comparative studies focusing on different species, you generate a biased knowledge towards the interspecific patterns and what is beyond. I give you two examples here. One is about the relationship between brain size and group size, which is the basic for the social brain hypothesis, which emphasizes that if you live in a very complex social groups, you need some cognitive power in order to remember your mates and peers, and to cope with the social environment in which you live. So this generates a positive interspecific relationship between brain size and group size. There are also some studies that try to focus on behaviors. For example, this example on the right, which is about the play complexity of some muroid rodents, and this study was able to characterize the complexity of a play behavioral trait for 13 species, and the question was whether this behavior is correlating with the level of social interaction. And although there was a promising pattern towards the expected direction, given the low sample size, this was far from being significant. So this, I think, emphasized the challenge that if you want to focus on behavior, that is also an important component of the story, you have to deal with a smaller sample size, and you may not be able to recover biologically important patterns. So if we go back to this slide and we try to see if there are other approaches that might be useful, that might have been overlooked, I can suggest that perhaps there is a very nice system just in front of our eyes that we may have overlooked for this purpose. And I propose that dogs may particularly useful objects and study system to study social evolution, and therefore they would correspond to experiments, they would correspond to within species variation, and they would correspond to artificial selection approach, which might be a nice addition to studies that are focusing on interspecific variation. So if we focus on dogs, what we can see is that there is also an enormous amount of variation among different dog breeds. These breeds, they belong to the same species, and they differ enormously in morphology and behavior, and perhaps this study system can be used to make some inferences about social evolution. So dogs, as we know, they all originate from wolf. They belong to the taxonomically, they belong to the Canidae group of mammals. And if we look at their social organization, we can see that all canids are very social. The most spectacular social life, what we can see, is in the wolf. They live in families, they are related individuals, they live in these packs for a long time. So this is a permanent and stable social structure. They do a lot of things together, they care for the offspring together, they hunt together. And what is important, that they have a specific dominant structure, which involves a lot of social interaction. So they have to use many signals and dynamically reorganize the social structure. Other canids, they also can have this pack structure, but at least, for example, the foxes, they they can characterize by being in breeding pairs, but they also remain together for a considerable amount of time, at least. So if we look at this variation, the dog, especially the modern dogs, they cannot, they do not live in stable groups. They live with their owners, but sometimes they meet each other, and then they can still use some of the original signaling repertoire that they used in the within species context. Some dogs that became ownerless and they go back to the wild, they also remain solitary, or they form occasional groups of few unrelated individuals, but this structure is far from being the family, the wolf-like family. What is important and distinguishable in dogs that they live with the human, so their social relationship is actually corresponding to a heterospecific social relationship where they do obey human social rules. They use specific signals in this context, and they appreciate human dominance. So this is a specific social structure that dogs have. Okay, what we should understand and know about dogs, that they have evolved from the wolf about 40,000 years ago. The place of origin can be, depending on what you read, it can be in Asia, Middle East, and Europe. But at least what is a general thought is that this relationship with the human started with the natural selection. This was a mutual and commensal relationship. Some wolf lived close to human populations, and they shared some food and protection with each other. So this is, in principle, still natural selection. Then domestication, when the ancestors of dog became a part of the human society started, there were no selection for particular function or any attribute. This started a bit later, about 44 and 8 years ago, 8,000 years ago, when humans recognized that for specific functions or other needs, there can be they can apply selective breeding, and they can derive breeds that fulfill their needs. Today, we can observe more than 400 modern breeds that have been selected in the last 200 years. And what is also important, that within these breeds, we often apply crosses to create new breeds. What is important also, and an interesting phenomenon in relation to dogs' evolution, is that what is called the domestication syndrome. This is a quite general phenomenon that is also observed in other domesticated animals. When they became domesticated, some traits show consistent changes. Their morphology, physiology, and behavior becomes distinct from the wild ancestors in a consistent direction. And this is assumed to be due to some changes in the genetic regulation during the embryogenetic development that subsequently select for correlated traits. But these correlated traits are thought to evolve in order to strengthen the relationship with the human. And what is also important that the same process can be also observed after domestication during the differentiation of modern breeds, because we can see that the recent breeds, they can also be discriminated by certain behavioral packages, and this constitutes differences in their temperament, and what is important that these are actually also behavior correlations, and the same constraints that mediate the domestication syndrome may be in effect at this level as well. And what is also important in this temperament issue is that actually we humans and owners, we are also different in terms of personality. We also can have different preferences for the dog temperament. So this is why you also often observe a match between the temperament of the owner and the dog. But what is important here is that this interbreed variation in behavior was actually generated by our expectations and by our differences in our preferences. So we created these breeds to fulfill our preferences or differential preferences. So this also emphasizes the defined details of the social relationship with the human. So it's not a homogeneous relationship, but for this we need to understand the behavior of the dog and also the preference of the owner, and this is what we can observe when we are studying and looking at the among breed variation in behavior in dogs. So having this system in our hand, I propose that we can make some nice studies to understand some fine details about social evolution. So we can use the evolutionary ecological approach to study this among breed variation, and therefore we can focus on within species patterns that were generated over a relatively short time scale. And I'm hoping to convince you that this system is a powerful system to perform analysis with a large sample size and with a comparable measure, and that can be also used to get some insights on heterospecific social interactions. So I give you some methodological details here, how we measure, how we characterize behavior in different dog breeds. These studies, in our studies, we relied on the Dog Mentality Assessment Project, which was initiated by the Swedish Working Dog Association in 1981 to describe dog personality along a sequence of challenges of dogs, whereby a test leader person scores the behavioral response of the dog in different environmental situations. This is a very popular among owners, so they like to bring their dogs for this test. So there are many volunteers, and as for today, there are more than 100,000 individuals that have been scored. They belong to almost 300 breeds, and on average, they have more than 300 observations per breed. From this sequence, we used a component that describes playing behavior, and for this I show you a video. This is the part of the sequence where play behavior is assessed. In this test, the owner initiates a playing with a piece of rag, and they start to throw back and forth this toy, and they try to stimulate the dog to play. And in this case, the dog doesn't show too much interest. I show you the others. Another dog.
How do you go at the
the same test. And this dog is very playful. So after the test leader gives a score along this 5 scale, and this describes the playfulness of the given individual. If you have many dogs from the same breed, they can differ. For example, this is 2 examples are given here for 2 different breeds. What you can see is that for both breeds, you can have a large variation in the scores given, but if you have a large number of individuals, you can still see clear differences, even though they have overlapping scores. The Belgian Malinois has systematically higher scores, while the Eurasia has systematically smaller scores. So you can reasonably say that the Belgian Malinois is more playful than the other breed. But you have to remember that later you have to appreciate this within breed variance. So you don't want to forget this variance. This will come back later. And also, just to, a short note that this within breed variance is also of interest, because there can be factors that determine this variance. For example, one clear predictor of playfulness within breed is the age of the individuals, because as individuals are getting older, they are less active in playing. But the nice thing is here is that different breeds that are represented by different colors in this graph, they can have different slope. Some breeds they lose their playfulness quite quickly, while other breeds they maintain playfulness for a longer period of their life. But what is important for us for the framework we are working is the among breed variance. So let's represent each breed with the mean score for playfulness, and to examine whether this is a reliable estimate of playfulness. We can verify whether this measure correlates with other estimates that are also relevant in the same context. We checked the literature for similar data, and there are other studies that used playfulness, but they applied a sort of questionnaires with the owners, and from this they assessed playfulness. If you calculate average playfulness from these questionnaires, you will find a very strong correlation with the playfulness we obtain from direct behavior observation. So we are good here. And also we can check whether playfulness correlates with trainability. And we also have a very nice pattern showing that if the dog is playful, this is also a trainable dog. So this is at the among breed level, and this verifies that we have a reliable estimate of playfulness that are coming out from our behavioral assays. We can look also the literature, and we can also see other studies using the DMA scores, and they also assessed correlations with other behavioral traits. And this study showed a strong correlation between play behavior and curiosity, sociability, and shyness, boldness. So again, we can see that playfulness is a component of a behavioral syndrome. So it correlates with many other behaviors that probably reflects the strengths of the social relationship with the human. So this is about the methodology behind obtaining these behavioral scores, but how we put this in the comparative context. So in principle, we have to use the same methodology that we are using in the among species studies, because we have non-independent data, because if your data is phylogenetically structured, two closely related species or units are not statistically independent points. So this is actually, this also applies in this context, because dog breeds, they have a history, a shared evolutionary history. They originate from the wolf, from the common ancestor, and then we have artificial selection, which generate a certain degree of relatedness among breeds. And on top of that, and this is the interesting part of the story, on top of that, you have some horizontal gene transfer, because, as I mentioned, dogs can be crossed with each other, and this opens routes for this horizontal transfer. If we put this in the context of our study, and extend this to the confounding effect of the within breed variance, we can have this so-called three-dimensional comparability problem in dogs, where we have an issue with the common origin, with the phylogenetic relatedness. We have an issue with the gene flow effect, and we have an issue with the within breed variance. So you need a statistical approach in which you can incorporate these three confounding effects. And this approach is called the phylogenetic mixed model, and in which you use this sort of equation to describe the actual behavior that you observe in a certain dog breed, which is composed of a dog-specific average that is inherited from the ancestor, and to which you can add the breed-specific phylogenetic effect, and the gene flow effect, and the sampling error effect. And you will be able to fit this model if you had an appropriate data to characterize these random effect component. So what you need to fit this model, you need genetic data, which is already available from this study. these authors use an exhaustive genetic mapping along 150 points of the genome, and they calculated the overall genetic distance among the genomes of different breeds, and based on that they could reconstruct the phylogenetic history of breeds in this form. So this is what you generally do in a comparative study. Here you have a combined effect of the common origin and the subsequent artificial selection that generate this relatedness pattern in the genome. But if you analyze the same genetic data by different approaches, and you go through the genome with a 100 nucleotide wide window, and you check how many of the alleles found within these windows are shared with other breeds, you can calculate the haplotype sharing, and this strongly reflects the effect of gene flow, because when different breeds are hybridized, the haplotype sharing between them will be high. So this could be an estimate of the degree of gene flow between different breeds that is independent of their phylogenetic position on the tree. So this is this reflects the gene flow effect at the genetic level. So if you have this kind of data, you can actually fit the model, because to specify these random effects, you need to have this data. So the random effect for phylogeny is defined based on a normal distribution with a zero mean, and with a component that consists of the phylogenetic relatedness matrix that is multiplied by a scalar that is the phylogenetic variance. And in the same way, the gene flow effect is characterized by also a normal distribution with a zero mean, and with the component that is coming from the haplotype sharing matrix, and that is multiplied by the variance due to the gene flow. Similarly, within species variance can also be used to characterize the measurement error random effect. So you can, if you have the data for A, you have the data for B, you have the data for M, and you have the data for playing behavior, which is your response variable. You can estimate the beta, the overall dog-specific mean, and these variance components. So numerically, if you fit this model, you observe this result, and what is important here to see that the variance for phylogeny is much more higher than the variance that is explained by gene flow, and to make interpretations, you can plot the data like this. Here I took the phylogenetic tree on which I superimposed the phenotype and the estimates of the phenotype at the ancestor branches and roots, and this is the pattern that we can observe. And one message from the model is that the ancestor trait, the ancestor dog had apparently an intermediate play behavior, and if you look at dog-wolf hybrids, you can actually also observe that these hybrids, they also show intermediate playfulness. So this was already an ancestral state. So upon domestication, dogs may have had certain level of playfulness already. The second point from this result is that when once a higher level of playfulness evolves, this remains in this in the daughter lineages, and these higher level of playfulness remains in certain groups of dog breeds. On the other hand, lower level of playfulness is it seems to be more incidental, so it only emerges along the tips of the phylogeny. It doesn't seem to be a trait that has been once selected and maintained in the past. So what are the next question is, what are the predictors that actually select for differences in play behavior? And one obvious candidate is the function of different breeds, because what we can see among breeds that they have been selected for very different functions, and we can assume that social rules and playfulness may be they play different roles in this function. Remembering that most of these functions need to be verified by frequent training between the dog and the owner. So whereby we can imagine that playfulness might have some role. So we tested this idea, and we added function to the model. For this, we used the categorization of the American Kennel Club, in which uses 7 categories to describe function, and to what we can see that these categories are important predictor in the model. They explain significant amount of variance in the among breed variance of play behavior, which means that some groups are systematically have higher playfulness, while others might have lower playfulness. To interpret this visually, I also rely on this graph. I use the same figure on which I put the ancestral state estimate for function in a form of these pie diagrams, and these give the probability of different function being at that particular node. So what is the main message from this analysis is that herding and sporting dogs, they systematically have higher playfulness than the average. And this can be well explained by the fact that these breeds and these categories, these functions require extensive training and very close social bond with the owner, in which playfulness may be a mean that help these dogs to learn to fulfill their function. So this is why they found to have higher level of playfulness. On the other hand, there was an interesting pattern, in particular that in toy dogs we found a lower level of playfulness. And this was interesting because toy dogs are companion dogs, and one can assume that companion dogs need to be playful with the owner. But perhaps in this case, due to their small size, these playfulness is not favored, because due to their small size, they might be vulnerable when playing with relatively large humans. Also, one explanation can be that if we consider the environment where they live, these are typical city dogs, people who live in small apartments, they can have these dogs. And in these environments, maybe it's not very useful if you have a too agile and too active dog. So low levels of playfulness may be more useful in this context. I have seen that the time has passed, so I will skip some preliminary results, and I try to sum up. Hopefully, I could convince you that using the dogs and the enormous amount of information that is available on these animals, either from behavioral tests or questionnaires, I suggest that this can be exploited for scientific purposes, because they offer a powerful system to study aspects of social evolution over a relatively short time scale. You can have a large number of sample size at both at the within breed and also at the between breed context. You can have very standard and comparable estimates, so you don't have the apple and orange problem when you are trying to compare different subjects. Now we have the genetic background and data to appropriately control for common ancestry and gene flow, and we can also incorporate within breed variants in this model, which is an important aspect in this system, and which we should appreciate and include in the statistical models. And when you use this system, you can have some important implications about social evolution, but also about domestication, and also a nice twist that is mediated by the fact that actually this is social interaction between two different species. And I think this is also a particularly interesting part of the story. Of course, there are many things to do. We have a lot of plans to do and continue along this line of research. For example, it would be interesting, and there are comparative tools that are available to make inferences about causality, whether function comes first and then playfulness, or vice versa. Also, I think it's an interesting issue to differentiate between human dog and dog-dog context, because the function of the social rules are different in the two contexts, and also the functions of different behaviors might be different. For example, if you think about fighting dogs, when you have a very playful dog with the human but very aggressive behavior towards other dogs, so this is also an interesting direction to take. Also, I mentioned about the importance of breeding within breed effects. In our statistical models, we just control for this as a confounding effect. But I think the next step would be to make models in which you simultaneously model within breed variants and the between breed variants, and you could discriminate between effects that are operating at the breed level and that are operating at the among breed level. For example, if you remember, I showed you this figure about the relationship between age and playfulness, and this also shows clear differences among breeds. So this would be an obvious next step to examine this relationship by equally considering within breed and among breed variances. I also emphasize that when we think about dogs and domestication, we have to think about more traits in parallel because actually it appears that different behavioral packages are selected together to fulfill some rules in social interactions. And of course, selection may interact with these packages, with these syndromes, and it might be straightforward to focus on more than one behavior and to see what are the evolutionary constraints that actually break the links between different phenotypes. And finally, of course, we need more predictors to understand how, for example, life history, cognition, or inbreeding depression affects playfulness in particular, but in social in general. So there are still many questions to ask and to test, and I hope this little summary about our current research has given you an idea of the potentials of the system, of this system that can be that can offer us to understand patterns of social evolution in a within species context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, László, for a fascinating presentation that, yes, you open up saying that you hoped, or that actually you did see an opportunity with your more recent research to contribute to the seminar series on social evolution, and I have no doubts you've done so. So thank you so much. For just a reminder to our regular attendees and those who may be joining us for the first time, we ask that you do what I'm just doing now, that you type a question mark. If you would like to ask a question, you type it in the chatting window to everyone. And as much as possible, I'm going to try to be calling you on the order in which you place your question mark. I may sometimes allow myself the right to skip over people who have talked in the past, or we definitely want to get the students and our younger colleagues to have a chance. And sometimes they're still a little bit shy. Don't be shy. Jump in right now. Don't wait until it gets too late. But if you are late, we'll move you up the ladder arbitrarily. Yes. I will, again, this is another prerogative that I have since I'm hosting you. I want to start by asking you, of course, many of you will not be surprised that I am thrilled at listening to words like causality, constraints, confounders, standardization of response variables, all these things you mentioned as you were describing to us how you have decided to explore the evolution of social behavior with an intraspecies comparison. And if I follow well the main point, of course, I can see lots of benefits of doing it the way you are doing it with dogs. Can you comment some more as a consumer of phylogenetic comparative studies, not a producer of them, when those phylogenetic comparative studies, instead of taking the intra-specific approach, take the interspecific, intergenera, interfamily, when they're spanning 600 or 300 species of primates or 2,500 species of mammals, I am sometimes at a loss because of my ignorance in understanding the subtleties of these comparative methods that you describe to really appreciate what I can take home from the findings. So could you comment a little bit, how do you see what we're learning from your approach, just focusing on dogs, that could be translated, should be applied to these deeper time comparative studies? I mean, of course, we do not have standardized measures of, say, parental care. When you look at parental care in everything from a mouse to a gorilla. So what are the things that you would suggest to those of us trying to do this comparative analysis at a broader taxonomic range and a much deeper time scale that we can take from what you've just presented to us?
Yeah, one of the challenges I find in interspecific comparative studies is the comparability problem, that you have very different systems, and even if you use the same approach to characterize behavior, you might end up having a measure that reflects something very different. For example, I worked on bird song, and this is a very typical problem, that if you do the same thing, you go to the forest, you record a bird, you use the spectrograms and you measure like song length, and you can do it for a large number of species, but the meaning of song length is very different for different species. So you cannot pull them together. And I think because what you find is not biologically is not interpretable, because you compare apples and oranges, and this is in general. I think this is also applies to many behavioral traits. Because so this is a limitation. So this is why I think my impression is that comparative studies on social evolution focus on traits that are rather crude, because they do not focus on behavior, but they focus on social structure, mating system, group size. These are easy to measure, and you can have an assumption that if you have a larger group, you have more complex social structure. So this is you can only detect the patterns that are very obvious, and so if you find something, it is meaningful. But if you don't find something, it doesn't mean that there is no evolutionary taking place in the background and affecting other traits, because if you have a crude measure, some fine mechanism may be overlooked.
Is there value in them? As somebody who understands the subtleties, the nuances of doing these comparative studies, when you read a comparative study spanning all of fish in the world and concluding something about the evolution of parental care in fish, I mean, do you look at it? I mean, I'm asking you because you understand better what they're doing than I do. I mean, do you take something home from this, or you're saying this is virtually a useless exercise? So what in trying to suggest to those is, I know I understand the limitations, but is there something that we can do to improve? There are limitations for every study. What can be done to improve? Or you think that it's really close to being a futile exercise to attempt this humongous comparative studies across various clades?
Well, I think actually Darwin was using comparative approach, so I think it's useful, because I think he made important discoveries by looking at the interspecific variation. So I think it does offer something if you handle the data and the methods appropriately. So you don't have, comparative approaches are basically correlations. So there are same problems apply when you have correlation that, correlation doesn't reflect causality. And also there can be the third variable problem that you find an association between two variables, but you don't know whether there is a third variable in the background that actually mediates this correlation. So you always have to appreciate that actually there is something in the background that you are not accounting for in your analysis. So you have to be open-minded. And but as I say, there are two kinds of issues that can be considered. I think when you speak about the third variable effect, you have a spurious correlation. So meaning that you would conclude that there is a causal relationship between two variables when there is no. So this is a type 1 error. So yes, in this sense, your responsibility is to think carefully and try to investigate all the potential confounders that you might have access to, because always you have a data limitation. So this is one direction, that you have to deal with this kind of type 1 error because you are working with correlations. And the other one is that we were talking about before, is that when you find nothing, but there is some mechanism that cannot be discovered or recovered because you either used a crude measure or either you used an appropriate variable, and the evolution, it works at the finer scale. So there are the two issues I generally find important to be careful in your comparative analysis. So when you find something, you have to be careful and consider that there might be a third variable, or when you don't find something, it is always possible that you just have the wrong variable that you used in your study.
Thank you. I'll take the first question now. It comes from Maren Hook. I ask, please, just briefly introduce your name and where you are, please. Maren?
Hello, my name is Maren Hook. I'm from the University of Derby in the UK. Thanks very much for the very interesting talk. And I was going to ask whether you consider or have considered adding two more levels of complexity, which is, the kind of socialization and link to that, so psychological attributes of the owner. Because, I mean, if you think a dog is socialized in a family with small children, everybody friendly, or you have the street bully who uses the dog to emphasize his own masculinity or lack thereof, they will treat the dog differently, they will socialize the dog differently, and certain breeds are probably more likely to be with certain types of people. So the bulldogs with a bully and the Labrador with a family. So you will have effects that are not necessarily breed related, but potentially human related rather.
Yeah, thank you for the point. This is a very serious issue, and we should consider it. But just by using the behavioral data, we cannot do anything about that. But what we plan to do is that I mentioned that we have this questionnaires data. In the questionnaires data, the owners enter, basically they enter scores for themselves. So what you see here is that basically it's not about the dog, it's not about the owner, but the combination of the two. So what we can do is to process these questionnaires data and to compare to see whether there are systematic differences. For example, also the owners, they also provide some data about the social environment in which they raise the dog. And we can see, for example, that these social environments consistently differ among different breeds. So this would be a proof for what you are saying. And it's definitely there. The question is definitely there. It's very tricky with the data when it comes to testing the data, but yeah, we will try by using this questionnaire data.
Thank you.
So I want to skip a couple of you. I'll come back. I'm pleased to see our colleagues from the YouTube who are sometimes late in jumping in. We have a question from, I hope I'm pronouncing your name well, from Pooja Dongri. Pooja asks, really enjoying the talk. I was wondering how breeds are defined. I heard it can be difficult to specify what officially constitutes a breed, and that there can be a lot of disagreement about this. And would you only consider data from pedigree animals to infer breed typical patterns? Thanks, that's Pooja Dongri attending from YouTube.
That's an interesting question. In our study, we typically just consider the breeds as they were given in the data set. But yeah, for example, the behavioral test, the dog mentality assessment, only pure breed dogs are allowed. So the owners, they have to present the certificate of the dogs. And this is how the given dog is registered in the system. And I also assume that when you do the genetic study and you do the sampling, you also consider pure breed dogs that are that have certificate. But yeah, this I think leads to the same question about how do we define species in a comparative study when we are looking at the interspecific context. And one important component of the species definition is that you have to consider the species in their natural environment. So you can have a distinct species if they are not reproducing in nature. Even if the two species could be bred in laboratory, they are considered different species if they do not have reproducing individuals in the wild. And this is what we do with the dogs. If we maintain different dog breeds, we maintain the same barriers, because we do not in our social environment, we do not allow breeds to breed with other breed, although they could breed because biologically they belong to the same species. But if we, by artificial selection, and when we focus on breeds, on distinct breeds that have certificates, they are actually follow the similar species definition, because actually we are the environment that we are not allowing them to breed.
Eduardo, we cannot hear you.
The next question, thank you, Karsten. The next question is from Jing Yu Q.
Yeah, hello, my name is Jing Yu from University of Strasbourg in France. I'm working on the evolution of marsupial social organization with Karsten Chardin. So my question, so I saw in PowerPoint you said that the playfulness of the dog are so the ancestral state contribute more to the current playfulness of the dog breeds. So my question is, how do you know what ancestral state was, and how do you and how reliable is the results you get?
Yes. Could you still see the screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, actually, I was cheating a little bit because this was not in the model. Yeah, this one, right? Yeah, what we did is we, for this particular figure, we did ancestral state estimation. So this, what it does, it you have on the, what you know is the phenotypic expression on the tips of the phylogeny, which are the breeds. This is what you know. You know the phylogeny, which represents the evolutionary history of the dogs. And what you want to do is to trace the evolutionary history of the particular phenotype among this phylogenetic tree. And for this, there are particular ancestral trait estimation methods available. And this is what we did here. So I was cheating just because simplicity. I wanted to show this illustration, but of course you have to do a phylogenetic method to estimate ancestral states, which are coming from the combination of the tip values and also from the phylogeny. So it considers the relatedness among different breeds, and it tries to trace back the values towards the root. And of course, these estimates are coming with an uncertainty, and they do have a confidence interval around them. So, and yeah, well, on average, from these data, we say we can conclude that the ancestral trait was more likely to be somewhere in the intermediate level, but with a certain level of uncertainty.
So is this something you can do with Bayesian mixed model, or is it some no?
No, it's not. Yeah, it's not coming from the mixed model. It's there are different approaches available to do ancestral state estimation, and this is just one of them. And this is a very simple graphical tool. I can give you references if you want.
Yes, please, because that's very important to what I'm doing right now, actually. So is that so is that you run the trait back first, so you have the ancestral state first, and then you can run the Bayesian statistic model.
Say again, please.
Sorry. So you have to trace back to the ancestral state first, then you can run the mixed model.
No. You can run the two independently. Well, the second one, the ancestral state estimation, only makes sense if you have a signal for phylogeny, and this is what we found in our mixed model, because we found that we found that the phylogenetic effects has a considerable role. Therefore, we expect that the trait evolves along the phylogeny. So once you have this effect, you can be sure that actually your ancestral state estimations are making sense. So the two things are only related because first you need to prove that your data have phylogenetic signals, so they are not distributed randomly with respect to the phylogeny. And once you have this evidence, you can do the ancestral state estimation, because this makes sense. And this is what you can see in this figure, and you can understand how the phylogeny operates, because you see that the playful dogs are actually grouped together.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Carsten Schrading.
Yes, hello, I'm Carsten Schradin from the CNRS in Strasbourg, France, studying social behavior in small rodents in South Africa. Actually, I have a question to exactly the same slide. It shows very nicely this great system with so many different species where you know the phylogeny and the relatedness extremely, extremely well. Now, my question for this ancestral state estimation is, isn't it, I think you also said at the beginning of the talk, we know that the ancestor is the wolf. Wouldn't it make sense here to include data from gray wolves? Like, for example, if there's some data available from the Wolf Science Center in Austria to see or to validate how correct these ancestral state estimates actually are. It would be a very nice way, because normally we cannot do it. We don't know what happened in the past, but here, in theory, we have the opportunity to test the ancestor and see how good these models fit.
I think here we would have a comparability problem, because dogs, what we need on the tree is not the wolf, but the ancestor of the dogs. And because the ancestor of the dogs were already playing with the humans, but wolf in their natural environment, they do not play with the humans. So even if you, again, even if you could estimate, you can give a score to the dogs, you can give scores for the wolf in the same behavioral assay, you would actually measure a different thing, because this social challenge would function completely differently in a wolf life than in a dog's life. So what you would need to do is to have an ancestor for the dogs. Do you understand what I am trying to stress?
Yeah, I understand, but isn't it like at the Wolf Science Center, they try to raise dogs and wolves in the same way to avoid this influence on the environment? And maybe social play towards humans wouldn't be the best trait for such a validation of ancestral state estimates.
Yeah, but again, this is not a phylogenetically inherited trait. It is clearly the effect of the social environment, about which we have talked before, that it is very important to discriminate between the effect of the social environment and the genetically inherited trait. So even if you raise a wolf, you will, and measure playfulness, you will basically estimate the effect of the social environment and not what the genetically inherited trait that the wolf has. Does it make sense?
Thank you. I'm going to ask my friend Suleima to bear with me for a second. Let's go back to YouTube, so we really get our colleagues in YouTube joining in more vividly. So we have a question from Arlie Viljoen, and the question is, are there any other species that are as good or almost as good for studying evolution of intraspecific selection, such as bird species with hybrid variants, or even certain fish species?
Well, I would be very careful here, because I don't know the other system in much details, and I'm also quite new in the dogs world. I find that the data available for dogs are extremely good, because we have lots of data on behavior. Dogs are very popular, so and people like sharing their information about their dogs. And this is in front of us, so this is why I think they are in front of us. They live with us, and this is why I think they have so many data on them. So I would expect that other species or other systems that are less popular, they might have fewer data. So this is not by chance that dogs are popular and the most data are coming from them, because this is this is what mediates the data availability. And here we need to assemble data from different sources. We need to have genetic data from a very exhausting project. We also need behavioral data from another exhausting project, and and we can powerfully combine these data together. So my careful guess would be that perhaps the dogs are exceptionally good in terms of having access or providing access to this kind of data. In in nature, it's because also when you study different populations of the same species in the wild, you also need to apply the same concept. So you have to consider gene flow. So you need phylogeny for the different populations, but you also have to define. You need data to define the gene flow matrix based on the migration of individuals, and this is also very data hungry process, and you often have limitations to do comparative studies among natural population because of this, that you have data limitation on gene flow, for example. So you are left with these artificially selected systems. Dogs. There are so many dogs, so there are more than 400 breeds. They are well described. If you think about cats, I think I'm not a cat person, but as I know, there are about 60 breeds of cats are out there.
Thank you. Suleima, thanks for your patience. You're next.
Yeah, hi. Suleima Tang Martinez from the University of Missouri in St. Louis in the United States. And I have a question about play behavior, because I noticed that you really concentrated on human-dog play, but there are other types of play, like for example, and I have owned many dogs, they've all been mixed breed rescues, so maybe it's not applicable to this, but among my dogs, I have noticed some that play by themselves, like solitary play a lot. And other dogs absolutely never show any solitary play. And there's also dog play. And I wonder if you have looked at this, or if you know if there are any correlations between, if a dog is highly playful with humans, whether it's also more likely to do solitary play or play with other dogs. So that's one question. And I've also noticed that even within individual dogs, so this would be individual differences, some types of play activities, they seem to prefer some and not others. Like, for example, a dog that loves to catch balls may decide that, or may not decide, but may be the same dog that doesn't engage in, for example, playing tug. And some dogs seem to initiate play, other dogs do not. And so even if the dog that does not initiate play plays, it's at the sort of, invitation of the playful dog, but the quote unquote non-playful dog would never actually go out and initiate play. And in terms of dog play, I wonder if that would be more comparable. And this is with regards to Karsten's question. That would be, a valid comparison that what one could do with wolves. Because if you have dogs playing with other dogs, it might be able to compare that to what happens naturally or in a semi-natural situation with wolves. So that was my questions, I guess.
Thank you. These are also very important points. And actually, I was trying to make this point as well, that we are specifically focusing on a particular context. We are focusing on human-directed play behavior, when there is also a stranger is present. And also this corresponds playing with a particular object. And what we could test, we need to know whether our measure is general enough. First of all, what we did is we looked at correlation between playfulness from the behavioral data with correlation with playfulness from a questionnaire data, because some of them, they provide information about dog-dog play. And what is interesting is that playfulness in a dog-human context doesn't correlate with playfulness in a dog-dog context. And this is why I emphasize the fighting dogs, because this is a very nice example that you have a dog that likes to play with the human, with the owner, but when you put them on dogs, they do not play, they just fight. And given that it is a very different social environment for the dog, social context, because this is with the human, they have a particular social context, and with other dogs, they have a different social context. So this is why it is not surprising for me that dog-dog behavior, playfulness doesn't correlate with dog-human playfulness. Interestingly, and maybe this also confirms this, that we could also, from questionnaires data, we could gather information on playfulness with the owner and with the stranger, and these are correlating. So again, this reflects the importance of the social environment, and there is a distinction between human and dog context. And this is why, even though you could do play behavior in within the species, with the same species, you could perhaps add the wolf to the ancestor, but you would studying another social context, because this is about dog-dog context. And the other, and this is still an open question, because we should also estimate the effect of the particular object, because it would be interesting to see whether playfulness with a given object also correlates with playfulness with another object, if another object involved. Unfortunately for this, we do not have data. I mean, because these procedures are standard, and on one hand, it's good that all procedures are using the same protocol, they are using the same stimuli. This is good on one hand, because we can have comparable data, but on the other hand, we cannot do such correlations. But it would be an interesting next step. I completely agree.
Yeah, thank you. And one other thought that I'll throw out, I wonder whether the correlation that you get between dogs that are more playful and trainability might also be because for the dogs being trained, they may see that as a game. They may interpret that as a game. And I know I've noticed, again, and this is obviously all anecdotal, tiny sample sizes, but I've noticed that when I train my dogs, one of the things I try to do is to make it seem like it's a game for them. And they really, really seem to respond to that very, very strongly. And so, I mean, I'm not sure that there's any way that one can test this, because you can't get into the brain of the dog, but it just makes me wonder whether the higher trainability might also have to do with dogs interpreting at least some types of training as being a type of play.
Yeah, it's a plausible explanation. Again, we are in the trap of correlations, that we have a pattern that we can explain in very different ways.
Thank you. So we're going to go to the next question, which is from Ilvana Salas Leon. Ilvana, if you can please introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, my name is Silvana Salas. I am PhD student in integrative genomics in Santiago de Chile. And my question is about horizontal genetic transfer. You said that there is a horizontal genetic transfer in different breeds, but when I think on horizontal genetic transfer, I think on bacteria. I don't know how can you certainly know if genes are being horizontally transferred. If you could please explain me that. And also if these genes are being related with these social and playful behaviors.
These are questions that are completely out of my expertise, but of course, the genetic data we used for our studies was used to reconstruct the evolutionary history of the dogs, and we didn't make any assumption that these are the genetic locality, that actually these are the ones that code the play behavior. And actually this is what we need, that because we don't want that data are, or phylogenetic data are confounded by playing behavior. What we need is the sort of neutral markers that reflect the evolutionary history of the dog. So we don't want this we don't want that these genes that are particularly the genes that code for the behavior. So this was not our purpose. And what was your other question? The first part of your question?
It was about the horizontally genetic transfer in dogs in different breeds. You mentioned that in a part of your presentation, but I don't know how can you know that these genes are being genetically horizontally transferred and not being, I don't know, vertically inherited.
I cannot give you the answer, but what I can show you is that here is a pattern that is assumed to reflect gene transfer. And this is on the other side, there is the verification for our assumption that this is what we need, that we have a genetic signature, and we verify this with known history of hybridization. So you have high haplotype sharing, you have a very recent hybridization. So these two breeds came into contact very recently. So this is why we observe high level of haplotype sharing between them.
Okay, thank you. And I also wanted to ask you if there is any database with genetic data of different dogs breeds.
Yeah, this is I'm referring to this paper here, Parker. This is, there might be some answers to your questions, because they also looked, for example, the distribution of different diseases that are likely shaped by the transfer of different genes. And so I think if you are particularly interested in the genetic mechanisms, you should definitely read this paper, because there is a lot of information about this. But for our purpose, this is the key link here, that we can assume that, reasonably assume that this reflects the gene flow and the effect of crosses between breeds.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're gonna go to Amber, then to Andrew, then to Luz, and then to Eleanor. So you know, we have our next question is from Amber Wood Bailey from YouTube. Amber asks, do you think that naturally high levels of intraspecific variation aids the domestication of certain groups? I wonder if, as this is the same for rabbits, of which Oryctolagus has been widely domesticated.
Oh, can you repeat the question, please?
Do you think, Amber Wood Bailey asks, do you think that naturally high levels of intraspecific variation aids the domestication of certain groups? I wonder, this apparently is the same for rabbits, of which Oryctolagus has been widely domesticated. High levels of intraspecific variation associated with ease of domestication.
If you have, you mean if you have high level of intraspecific variation, and this would favor domestication?
That's the question apparently in rabbits, genus Oryctolagus. That apparently Amber says that is an example of that happening.
What I can speculate about this is that if you, in general, if you have high variation within a species or within a population, you can easily observe individuals with extreme phenotypes. And one of these extreme phenotypes might be useful during domestication. So actually this happens, I guess, with the dogs, because the extreme phenotypes that was favored during domestication is the boldness, because they didn't display a fear against humans, so they could approach them quite closely. So this is how I can imagine how a variation can enhance domestication in general. But I wouldn't say that those species in which you have high interspecific variation would have, in general, higher probability to being domesticated, because these several other issues are involved and constraints should be considered in this context.
Thank you. Next question is from Andrew Gersik.
Hey, hi, I'm Andrew Gersik. I'm in EEB at Princeton. I study animal communication across a few different species. And I had kind of a follow-up to Eduardo's initial question about methodology, which was just that Eduardo asked about the value of cross-species meta-analyses when there's so much variation in the definition of terms. And László, I thought it was really interesting that you pointed out that even traits like something that seems as straightforward as song length can have very different meanings across species and be sort of measured and examined in different ways across studies, so that you can really be doing apples to orange comparisons. And I wanted to ask at sort of the same level that Eduardo was asking you earlier, given your experience with that kind of meta study, do you lean towards thinking that as a field, what's necessary is a recognition that, as you say, there really can only be cross-species comparisons at this very coarse level with crude measures? Or do you think there's something about the practice of publication that could be done that could open up a lot more opportunity for meta-analyses? For example, if it became standard practice that an appendix to any paper was a very accessible, straightforward glossary of terms that defined how some of these things are being measured and how terms are being used, would that really change the ability to do meta-analytical work in socioecology? Or do you think that the apples and orange-ness of these terms and measures is kind of inherent to the biology of species and the nature of sociality? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would be very careful to make general conclusions, because each study's systems are they are very different. So, and the problem can be very different if you measure different traits, if you focus on different systems. So I can imagine that one approach for a system for a species group may be straightforward, but it might not be straightforward for another group or for another question. I think it's very difficult to give a general answer. I think what I would say is that it's always good to appreciate these limits and these problems. And if you can, you have to examine and investigate in your data. If you are aware of the limitations of your data, you are careful with your interpretation. But beyond that, I think this is system specific. Because I think we are leaning towards having more species and larger sample sizes. This is good on one hand, but then we are entering in the world of the apple-orange problem, because if you are involving more species, the probability of having the apple-orange problem is also increasing.
Yeah, but I would imagine that as a meta-analyst, I was thinking about the song length thing, and I could imagine two species where one sings a discrete song, one sings in bouts, and the really biologically relevant temporal measure is the bout for species A and the song for species B. But if I were trying to do a meta-analysis, if it were easily accessible to me that the bout length is an indicator of X for this species, whereas the song length is an indicator, again, of X for this species, if that were easier to access as I look across papers, I might have a better chance of looking across species in a meaningful way than it currently is, because it's pretty hard to dig into the papers and find those kinds of data about what the measures are indicating. Anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to go now to YouTube, and the next question is from Luz Guevara. Luz thanks you for a nice talk, and then she asks, can the personality of the owner during the playfulness test affect the response the dog has on the test if the owner is not showing much emotion during the play bout?
On one hand, yeah, the owner has an effect, as we discussed earlier, that because the prior bringing into the test, they have a particular social environment in which these dogs have been raised. So this is already an effect that we cannot get rid of from the data. In the test per se, I rely on the standard procedure that these tests are using. So I guess each owners are given the same instructions during the test. So the owners supposed to behave similarly in different tests. So, but still, yeah, I understand that there can be differences among individuals, and again, it's possible, but we don't have the data in this behavioral test to powerfully investigate. But I would rely that I would say that given that this is a standardized protocol, this is less important than the problem that we talked before, that actually the social environments from which the dog may come from may have a stronger influence.
Thank you. We can now take the question from Eleanor Crooks.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Crooks. I'm from the University of Derby in my second year studying zoology. I think my question's mostly been answered now, but what I was going to ask is the future direction where you're going to look at social contexts like living with kids and things like that. are you also going to look at dogs that live with other dogs, not necessarily dogs that play with other dogs, just that they live with other dogs? Because when you mentioned about toy breeds living in small apartments and in like cities, and that might be why they're not playing as much, I also thought maybe they don't live with other dogs for similar reasons, not enough room, landlords. I mean, that's generalized, but I was just thinking, is this something, dogs living with other dogs, would that be social context, or is it too much about interaction that you won't be able to look at it comparatively? But yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I get your question. Can you?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, dogs that live with other dogs at home.
Okay.
Would this be social context that I know you wanted to? You said with questionnaires, you might look at in the future. So social context like living with young children and things like that. So dogs living with other dogs at home, not necessarily dogs playing with other dogs, just living with them.
Yeah.
Would that be a social context that you might look into? And what I meant by the toy breeds, if they live in these small apartments in the city, obviously generalized, but they might not live with other dogs either.
Yeah, this is also important, and there are some questionnaires data.
Sorry, I'm in a student flat, and that was a like test fire alarm. Sorry about that. That was so loud. Carry on.
So yeah, in the questionnaires, there are some questionnaire programs in which you can find this kind of information. Yeah, how many dogs live in the same household, and also how many children live in the household. So this would be an obvious step to take to investigate how these social effects determines the outcome.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Sarah Marshall Pesini. Sarah, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Sarah. I work at the World Science Center. So in Vienna, I'm a senior scientist there. So I guess I was just thinking about what was raised about the wolves and the dogs. And just to share what we do know about the intraspecific play. So not with humans, but with each other. We don't seem to find differences in the frequency of play in our wolves and dogs there. But I think actually you had a really good point, László, and I really enjoyed your presentation. It's a fantastic method. That of course it would be better to have the ancestor, and we don't. But have you really thought about maybe including free-ranging dogs in your analysis? And by free-ranging dogs, I don't mean dogs that have been abandoned by their owner and end up being strays. But there's some really nice genetic studies, and I think Margorzata Pilot has done some nice work on this, where they show that the genetic variability of free-ranging dogs that have always been free-ranging, and they are even called free-breeding dogs, to sort of emphasize the fact that they make their own breeding choices. They are the closest we can have, if you want, of something that is not even the ancestral population, but it's still an amazing resource that for the moment we still have. So I guess the question is, have you thought about including this population of dogs, not the non-owned dogs, but the really mongrels, the free-ranging dogs that are still making their own lives and choices in this kind of analysis?
Yeah, it would be wonderful to work with them as well, but the problem is again the data availability, because you see that this project has been running for more than 20 years, and there are, for many breeds, there is an enormous amount of data, and if you just started this project, and this would be a major endeavor, because you have to reach the same sample size with these wild dogs. It would be very difficult. But
so can I just ask a follow-up question out of curiosity? What would be your minimum sample size that you would need to have a meaningful kind of analysis on these kind of populations?
Well, it depends also on the breed, but I did some simulation on that, and I don't remember the exact number, because yeah, in our case we have a very strong effect of the within breed variance. So you need a certain number of individuals to capture the breed specific value. And I did some simulation on how many individuals you need when you have such a big variation to capture this. And it was not few, but it was not that high. I mean, I don't want to say a number now, but I have to check this. That it's not few individuals. I'm sure, because yeah, this within breed variance is quite high, quite large. So you would need more than 5 and more than 10 individuals for sure.
All right, thank you.
As we approach the last few minutes, I think that the next question, which will probably be the last one, is going to push you, László, to the boundaries of, you've been an extremely humble, modest, and careful participant as you commented on questions that people were expecting a yes or no. So the very last one, it depends. So brace yourself for the last one, because now we're going to push you to really get wild with this one. I love it because it speaks of the comparative approach we take, and it really, we welcome all kinds of questions. So Francine Dollins, oh, you wrote it, but why don't you, I mean, Francine, do you want to read it yourself? You're not in YouTube, you're here, I saw you.
Yes, sure.
Go ahead with this question that will get us talking.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and a wonderful discussion. I'm really curious as to whether or not you think, or you could speculate as to whether humans have domesticated themselves. I do a little bit of research in this area, and I'm really curious about your thoughts on this. Thank you.
How about that?
If humans, can you elaborate on this a little bit? Maybe
Sure, yeah. So if you think about, weird humans, meaning the Western industrialized, educated, and so on humans, compared to people who are coming from more traditional cultures, so if we look at weird humans compared to other populations, I'm studying them in terms of their navigation and their spatial cognitive abilities, and don't have answers yet because we're still collecting the data. But I'm just curious as to whether you would speculate whether humans who live in these urbanized or, extremely westernized, industrialized sort of situations have domesticated themselves in terms of their behaviors. I don't know necessarily about genetics, but it could also relate to the genetics, but certainly in terms of the behaviors. And then for me, in terms of the cognition, and then the social relationships. So I'm just curious if you wanted to speculate. If you don't, I would certainly understand. Thank you.
Yeah, I understand. And yeah, you have a point, I think, but I would be very careful to label it as domestication. So urbanization, I'm very likely this is a different environment for the human. So this is a selection factors. This is a selection factor. People who live in the cities, they adapt to this environment. So this would generate an evolutionary process within the cities. And of course, I wouldn't be surprised to find differences among urban and rural populations in humans as well, as has been found in many animals. But I wouldn't call it domestication. This is my...
Well, I think that with that, I would like to, before we close, just to remind you that next week, we're going to get together to listen to Dustin Rubenstein. I don't have the title handy, but yeah, causes and consequences of sociality spanning molecules to populations. I would like to officially finish our meeting today, thanking László again for a wonderful presentation and as exciting questions and answers session. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for our colleagues joining us via YouTube. I understand, László, do you start meetings with the groups right away or 1:30? So you need to go, right?
No, we can continue. Well, I need a break of 5 minutes, but then